Hello, welcome in. The digital doors are open for our community conversation number 36. I'll wait a few more seconds before we get it started. I'm Nicholas, I'm the head of the Anticipation Hub. And great, maybe let's get started. Yeah, so good afternoon. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Community Conversation 36. It's really a pleasure to have you here, all with us here online today. As you know, or some of you might know, last week we gathered in Geneva for an initial in-person launch of our most recent edition of our global flagship report, the report Anticipatory Action in 2025, a global overview. And this was certainly a fantastic moment to celebrate how we have come so far. But today in this online launch, we really want to bring together the global community here into this virtual room. And yeah, this session is then really designed for us to look collectively at what the data actually tell us, so make really sense out of it, where assisting system is heading. Some of you might have seen the report already. It's online, and as you might have seen, it maps out how anticipatory action has really matured into a global approach. I think this is really evidenced by the record number of activations, the huge increase of active frameworks, but also the growing institutionalization, and a few highlight milestones, like for instance, the nationwide legislation in the Philippines. But alongside this massive growth, I think the report also shows some challenges and tensions, such as the need to align or coordinate, harmonize framework, to push further to reach regions, areas that are underserved, but also to become truly maybe multi-risk, and of course the ongoing challenge of scaling up anticipatory action financing. And to help us navigate this, we have designed this, I hope, very dynamic session over the next hour. It's basically split into two main parts. So first, we will lay out the foundation. We'll begin some opening remarks from Katrin from the Federal Foreign Office, followed by a short briefing on the key reports finding by Tim. And we will then pivot into a quick reflection round and the first Q&A with Ed from the START Network, Julia from OCHA, and Irene from the Climate Center. We'll unpack a bit of the data and some of the questions that you might have. And second, we'll then move into operational spotlight. We'll travel to the ground to see how have a closer look at the first activation in India, and then we will look at your take basically on the funding aspect. We tracked for the first time available built-in fuel funding, and keen to hear your thoughts on, for instance, what best balance would be, how we can tap into new sources of financing to scale up AA. And then at 3 o'clock we'll finish, but our digital doors will remain open. So anyone who wants to stay here, grab a coffee or other drink of your choice, please stay for another 30 minutes for really informal networking and open discussion and sticking around. Now, before we start, let me also really emphasize that this work is really a reflection of your work. It has been built on the desk research, on data, on hard work of your end to collect, reach out to field colleagues, and really across the entire Anticipation Hub network. So big thank you also to our team, to the Anticipatory Action Task Force, to the plus 40 co-authors and all data contributors. This is really always a massive lift, and but thanks to your efforts, the report is now a reality and it's out, and I hope it's useful. Now, to officially kick us off, I'd like to hand over to Katrin, who is from the German Foreign Office and the primary champion of this approach since we started this at the very beginning. So Katrin, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Nico. Thanks for inviting me, and it's very exciting to be here. First of all, congratulations to finalizing, launching the report, which I think is an excellent read. So my name is Katrin. I'm the focal point for anticipatory action and humanitarian disaster risk reduction here at the German Federal Foreign Office. And as Nico said, GFFO has been a long-standing supporter of anticipatory action and also a very proud supporter of the work of the Anticipation Hub and the Global Overview Report. And I think now we are already at the 4th edition of the report. So it has become a very regular yearly exercise, which I think is really great because every year we get the overview of what is happening in the world of anticipatory action. And I think we can really see big developments even in the last 4 years from 2022 and 2025. If we compare a bit the numbers and also the examples provided in the Global Overview Report, I think it's really striking to see how anticipatory action has grown both in quantity, and I think that's very obvious when we look at the figures, but also in quality, right? I was just comparing a bit the data, and it's great to see that in 2022, anticipatory action frameworks were covering 35 countries. Now we are already at 75 countries. And also the range of people protected by anticipatory action frameworks has grown a lot. We have now 3 times as many as activations than before. And we have doubled also the amount of funding, the pre-arranged funding available, right? But also maybe looking at the future and seeing how many more frameworks are under development, of course, we must also think about how we will finance this architecture in the future, right? Because we have doubled the amount of pre-arranged funding, but tripled the amount of active frameworks. But also if we are looking at the quality of anticipatory action, and that has already been mentioned by Nico, and we will soon hear much more about it, I think there are also many positive developments in terms of harmonization efforts for trigger development, coordination mechanisms. We have many countries now taking on the lead for anticipatory action in their countries through national technical working groups or through the development of national or even regional roadmaps for anticipatory action. And I think that's a really positive development. And yeah, I would really like to see that anticipatory action is becoming a standard, right? Both in a humanitarian system, but also for disaster risk management processes in different countries. And I think there we also have a play to role as donors, because anticipatory action, I think, should also become a standard financing line for donors. And it's the first time in this global overview report that we also have started to provide more transparent figures through our donor funding tracking exercise. And I hope we can continue this exercise in the future and also invite other donors to join these efforts. And maybe stopping here, because now we are all curious to learn more about the details of the report, and therefore handing over to Tim.
Yeah,
yes,
let's go straight
perfect.
to Tim.
Thank you, Katrin. I'm going to share my screen with some short slides. I do this very carefully so I don't bring up the cricket scores by accident. Can you see? Yeah. Great. Okay, so after 10 years, the 10 years refers to the first pilot projects. So we've not been doing the report for 10 years, but anticipatory action as a concept has been going for 10 years. So we're kind of, those who were at the Global Dialogue platform last year will remember that we look back at 10 years, and this is the first data set we've collected since that period. So as ever, the first is the activations. That is when a framework or a system somewhere around the world is triggered. Being a geographer, I'm always very happy to spend a few weeks each year putting together maps because I like maps. And you can delve into all this information in the report itself, but some of the interesting points to look at here are if zoom in on Somalia, for example, there was many activations for drought. Zoom in the Philippines, and there were several for cyclones and typhoons. And we're seeing kind of globally the same regions as in previous years are where the most activations took place. So that's Central and South America, excluding North Africa, the Sub-Saharan Africa region, and then in Asia Pacific, and particularly some of the islands down the bottom side there. I think something that is also interesting, and we could maybe ask Ed about this a little bit later, is we saw the first activation by the START network in Ukraine. So that was a new country for this year, and that was actually for a new hazard as well. So they anticipated the impacts of the electricity shortages, which took place in 2025, which shows some of the kind of diversification and expansion that Nico and Katrin touched on. And these are the numbers in summary. So there were 146 activations and 9.6 million people reached, not quite as many as last year, but there's a few reasons for that we can look at. The amount of funding released was largely similar to last year. And again, every month of the year, 54 countries and 17 hazards. One of the interesting things when you look at the other figures in the report itself is that, once again, the most activations, and indeed the most active frameworks when we get to that, were for drought and for the different types of flood, riverine flood, storm-induced flood, flash flood, and your standard flood. And that's been consistent in at least in the years that we've been collecting data for this report. So there's perhaps something to think about there, that while the number of hazards being anticipated and looked at is expanding, we still have a small subset of hazards, because cyclones, typhoons are in third place again. There's still most of the activity and most of the funding and most of the people reached are for those hazards: drought, floods, and then to a lesser extent cyclones. So maybe some of the panelists or some of the people who've joined us today could touch on that, whether they're the most established, whether they're the ones that are easiest to anticipate because of the lead times or because of the kind of we know how to forecast them. But yeah, we'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that as well. This is the active frameworks in the country around the world. Nice full map. If you compare it to the map very, very quickly in 2022, you can see an awful lot more little icons and an awful lot more countries are in darker turquoise. One of the themes that we touch on in the report, but has also been a big discussion point, is the need to coordinate and our frameworks, not better, but more closely, and make sure that the organizations in the country are working together. And again, if you look at some of the icons for particular countries, so Bangladesh with cyclones and the Philippines with cyclones as well, that's often not, what is it for the Philippines, 10, I think. It's not 10 individual cyclones for that year. But sometimes different organizations activate ahead of the same cyclone. And what a lot of countries are doing is looking to coordinate better, have one trigger mechanism, or even in some places have a government-led activation system. So it's possible that we might, in the future, see fewer active frameworks in place, because there will be one national or one coordinated framework for the country. And again, we would like to hear from people today whether you think that's the way things should go. So kind of one framework for each hazard per country, or whether there's a value in having a number of different ones, because they might cover different areas, they might have different sets of actions, or maybe there are organizations that sort of want to work more in a more agile manner. And here are the summary figures for the active frameworks in 2025. I think I mentioned already, drought is already going off the scale. The size of a pavement, we couldn't extend the axis along it far enough, so that was 69. And again, the different types of floods were 96. So similar to the activations themselves, perhaps not unsurprisingly, those are the hazards covered by the highest number of active frameworks in 2025. Moving on to the next slide, another nice map. This is the frameworks under development, and this is where we see what's going to be coming in the next couple of years. And I think what we have seen over the years we've been collecting this data is not every framework under development becomes a framework that is ready to be activated, and there's different reasons for that. Some are kind of on permanent hold, or some kind of countries or organizations change what they're focusing on. But a quick kind of takeaway from this would be South America is looking very full there to me, and I think our colleagues from Central America might be a bit early for them to join this call. But they would say there's been an awful lot of progress in that region, with new countries coming on board and looking to develop different hazards for different frameworks. I've never quite got an answer. Why Central America was in the lead. It's not a part of the world I know very well, but it seemed that in the early years, an awful lot of the activity was taking place in Central America, and now South America is kind of, I don't want to say catching up, but also developing its own framework. So any kind of insights from people that work in that region there, that would be interesting for me to know. And let me move on. And this is the frameworks and numbers again, floods and droughts there. But we're also seeing, this is another trend, which one of our working groups is quite interested in. We're seeing an increasing number of multi-hazard frameworks. So people are not just having one hazard in focus, but looking at some of these complex risks and these interactions between hazards, and the idea that you can't sort of anticipate one hazard without bearing in mind the broader context of what's going on. Next, we move on to the institutionalization. This is a data set that my colleague Nico is very active with, and he's the one that collects all the data here. By institutionalization, what we mean is governments taking a strong lead or national systems being set up to steer anticipatory action within a country. So not this siloed approach where every organization kind of plows on under their own steam, but looking at ways that things are better coordinated, better aligned with each other within a country so that we can make the most efficient use of resources. What we have here is a kind of an expert analysis. We've asked people with expertise in those countries to give us their perspectives on the current status. And the countries in darker turquoise that you can see, they've got a national level technical working group in place to advise on triggers, to steer what's happening. They've developed a strategy or roadmap for anticipatory action within the country, whether for a specific hazard or as an approach overall. Or they have a government authority that is now leading the development and coordination of anticipatory action in that country. There's some overlap, I guess, with the previous map. So, we're seeing a lot in South America. We're seeing a lot in sub-Saharan Africa. It's interesting. There's a couple of countries in there, Botswana and Namibia, and I think either Lesotho or Eswatini, I'm not quite sure. They haven't actually got active frameworks yet. So they've kind of done it a reverse way around. They haven't kind of set up the system within their countries and then looked to bring in the government level actors. They're doing it a different way around. They're kind of starting with the government level approach. And if anyone has any insights from those countries, we'd be keen to hear more to find out, what's happening and where the latest status is. And also just up in the top left of Africa there, Mauritania. There's been quite a lot happening in Mauritania this past few months. We've had a few articles in the Hub, and that's also a country to keep an eye on, maybe, and sort of as a country that's made quite a lot of progress in terms of institutionalization in a short period of time. And yeah, that was a very quick whiz through the summary. But now we're going to hand over to some of our panelists, starting with Julia, I think, to give us a reflection on the data and what they take away from the report.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Julia, over to you. What key takeaway from the report, key insight, what surprised you, resonates with you?
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me. I'm Julia from OCHA, Global AA Coordinator. So I think my comments come as no surprise. I mean, first of all, I think the expansion that we're seeing is extremely encouraging. We now really, we have an ecosystem, truly an ecosystem of diverse actors, frameworks, hazards, tools, and that's a huge achievement. I think what I'd like to focus on, and I'm not going to repeat the data that's already been presented, is a little bit of perhaps a structural challenge underneath that growth, and that's about the coordination angle. I think the issue, we're seeing growing scale. I think we have a lot more opportunity for scale, and we need more scale for anticipatory action to truly, play out its potential. But what we are also seeing in the report is, to some extent, fragmentation and under-resourcing. Among the active frameworks, apparently 26% don't have any budget at all. And 53% of active frameworks operate with less than $250,000. The median level of a framework, I think, is about 300,000. dollars, and we know that OCHA is providing 50% of all the funding for about 8% of all the frameworks. So we have, you know, the funding is, and the funding is not distributed, and I don't think it should be, you know, trickled equally across all the 262 frameworks, but I think you know, we are seeing that that there is some fragmentation. We're also seeing, I think Tim just pointed out, of the 262 active frameworks, 150 are overlapping country hazard frameworks. So that means there are more frameworks for a specific hazard in a specific country, right? So the challenge is not only that we have many frameworks, but we have many small parallel frameworks that often address the same risks in the same places. And that means that resources are thinly spread across multiple initiatives. I think systems are sometimes more complex than they need to be. And governments are asked to engage with multiple parallel approaches. So I think that in the kind of the next, what that tells me is that in the next phase, we just need to better connect and consolidate what we have, and expand, and, you know, have ideally one shared framework per country and hazard, or at minimum a clearly coordinated architecture, and, you know, that's not something that any, I think, of the implementers can individually decide, but it's something that as a whole system, together with also the donors and partners who invest and support these initiatives, that we all need to drive that collectively, so that the innovation that we have, and I don't mean to limit innovation, but we need to make sure that translates into greater impact. So it's I think we're at a point where, you know, we're expanding, and the question is not whether we expand anticipatory action, but how we organize that expansion. That's it. Back to you.
Thank you, Julia, for these initial reflections. Yeah, and now I would like to open up this conversation for the first round of Q&A. If you have a question or comment or reaction to the report's finding, or just to Julia's point, just raise your hands. Either Julia or Ed or Irene will try to answer them, or we will facilitate or see who is willing or wants to contribute. Katrin, you've got a comment or question. Over to you.
Yes, I was very much intrigued by the numbers that Julia referred to about the, you know, what's the average amount for one activation, and how is that money unequally split. But I'm not sure whether is that information in the report. I was just going through the pages. Is that in here, or is it some additional calculations you made?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. My guess is that Julia used the data. We make the data sets that we collected available online. They're on the Anticipation Hub as Excel tables. So it's possible to do your own calculation. That information, as far as I remember, is not in the report itself. But yeah, that's the reason we kind of make the data sets available, so people can look at their own trends in their own focus areas. So
okay, that's great to know. But because I think it's really interesting to have a look at these very detailed information, because it really shows us the variety of activation, small scale activation, but also large ones, and how that fits together, right? And one question related to that, when we look at the active frameworks, right? I mean, do we have any information whether all of the active frameworks also have secured pre-arranged funding? I mean, can we know that, or?
Yes, it's basically in the report, or not in the report, in the table. There you have the pre-arranged, the amount of pre-arranged funding behind
Each active framework,
right? Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thanks so much. So I'll have a look at these detailed information.
You're on mute, Tim.
This is something that the Asia Pacific Technical Working Group has been looking at, because they found that some of the projects that were set up in that part of the world had maybe funding to build the framework, which we're going to touch on the build and fuel a bit later, and then they may have had fuel funding for the actual activations for a couple of years, but they've now reached the point where that funding has run out or expired or has not been renewed. So they have a framework that's ready to be activated, but they don't have the funding behind it secured. So I think it's by and large, it's mostly smaller NGOs that have this, because obviously the UN agencies will have access to the CERF in a lot of cases, and the Red Cross Red Crescent movement has access to the DREF, the anticipatory pillar of the DREF. They can set up their EAP. So it tends to be NGOs, I think. And it does also raise the question, which we kind of reflected on before collecting this report. If you have a framework that doesn't have any secured funding, does it count as active? Because can it be actually activated at the time? And I think CARE, Climate Justice Centre, and the Asia Pacific Technical Working Group have been looking into that, about what it means if you have a framework that's ready to go but you don't have access to the funding.
Okay, good. I see the questions are now coming in. Deborah, you're next. Comment, a question. Floor is yours. You're still muted in case you're speaking. Deborah?
She can't open the mic, Nico. She says yes.
Okay, does it work now?
Try again, Deborah, please.
Yes, I think you should be able to hear me now.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I had another question to Tim regarding the data that's available online. I see that the numbers are a bit different from what's in the report. Are you still updating the data tables for the newest release? So for example, there for frameworks, it seems to have 156 frameworks for which the data can be downloaded. And for the activations, it says 208, which I guess is over the different years. But with the active frameworks, it doesn't seem to coincide quite with the frameworks we have in the latest report.
I will have to check that, because the data that is uploaded should be the data I used in the report, unless something's gone very badly wrong. I'll check.
Okay, thanks.
Someone else with a question who wants to come in particular on Julia's challenge on the scaling paradox. Are we building too many isolated small-scale framework, or how can we advance harmonization? Irene.
Yes, thanks a lot, Nico. Mine is a comment related to the data that we have here is mainly focused on what we call the formalized plans, that have prearranged funding, that have the actions already defined, and then the triggers and all that. But we've also realized, particularly when we were doing the evaluation of the IFRC framework as well, that there is anticipatory action that happens out of these defined frameworks. And so the report does not necessarily focus on those, but we do acknowledge that there is lots of AA that that happens that does not fit within our formal definition. So for example, we do know communities do take some anticipatory action at community level, and it may not come through into our formalized plans as well. So I just wanted to put that comment out there as well, that the funding is tied to the frameworks that we are formally defining here, but we do have AA happening beyond our formal definition of AA and the plans. Thank you.
Thank you. That's certainly a good comment, as this all numbers, of course, needs to be treated as minimum estimates. I see a question or comment from Nicola. Over to you.
Nicola can't open the mic.
Okay, that seems to be a challenge, but we'll get better at that with every exercise, I hope. Can you retry, Nicola? Yes.
Here I am.
Yes,
thank you.
Wonderful.
Hi. No, just first of all, just to say once more how important this report is for the community. So congrats as usual for this big effort. And then just on the comment around the many frameworks that we see into the various countries, I think it is indeed a call for harmonization for sure. But then how we think about harmonization, I think, should be clear in the sense that it's not necessarily about centralizing the work, but rather, I would say, trying to consider those frameworks as a sort of little federation of frameworks where there are different actors maybe acting in different areas. As long as there is some sort of buy-in and overall guidance from the government and national and local authorities, and as long as the various frameworks speak to each other somehow in terms of the approaches for triggers, who are the target people to avoid overlaps, ensure complementarities, in the end, I think it is fine because there will always be some nuances, maybe in some cases, depending on the actors implementing the sector, certain areas that are maybe prioritized more by certain organizations. So I think that's fine as long as there is this sort of federation approach to the frameworks. They shouldn't be out there by themselves, and the government should play that coordinating role. And I do think the technical working groups in many of those countries are already doing a great job in linking the dots. So we should continue to nurture the partnerships that we're seeing in many countries through the working groups, possibly led by the governments.
Thank you, Nicola, for this call. And I like also the term federation of frameworks. First time that I hear that. Sounds great, in fact. Ed, do you want to jump in this? Do we need, should we aim for federation of frameworks? Do you have any comment on that?
I'd echo what Nicola says there. I don't think the proliferation of frameworks, protocols for the same hazard in the same country necessarily means that they are unaligned. In fact, I think a lot of them will be using the same risk analytics. I know for start, we have borrowed many of the models and risk analytics that partners on the call have used. And I think it's understandable that perhaps different agencies still want to report that they have their own protocol for this global overview so that their AA is represented. I'd also add a point kind of to that conversation around what is perhaps more of an issue for the AA community, which is these protocols which are not funded with fuel fund kind of sustainably. I think there are actions we should do to look at funding sources that are available. Certainly, a lot of those NGO protocols, we've seen examples where there might have been an end in the fuel fund that the NGO has for that funding, but they've managed to leverage it or use it to access other funding sources. So Start Network, Start Fund, we have seen alerts to our fund using protocols, risk analytics to kind of draw down on the funds from the Start Fund. So I'd encourage anyone on the call or who has an agent who has a protocol that's not currently funded, do think about those other funding sources, look to the Start Fund, for example, and access funds, make use of that risk analytics and all that work that's already gone into the development of protocol.
Right, super. Thank you, Ed. I see another question from Lars in the chat. We'll get back to that later, as I now would like to spotlight the first activation, we had in India, and then the aspect around fuel and build funding. And then we go to another round of Q&A, and again, we have still more time than afterwards to dive into a few aspects of the report. So Rohan, I see you're online. Could you tell us a bit more about the last year's activation in India and heat waves? Rohan, over to you.
Hi everyone.
Fantastic to have you with us.
Good to see everyone here. Thanks, Tim, Nicholas, and the others for this opportunity. Also like to take this opportunity to thank Larissa, who has been supporting us actively from our Germany office. I'm fully aware that I have a couple of minutes, so I'll be very quick in sharing details about our activation on extreme heat in India last year. So why extreme heat? First of all, it is a global problem, and temperatures are rising everywhere. But India is one of a handful of countries where we're really feeling the extent of really extreme weather, and that is directly contributing to a lot of heat health related issues as well. Um, just to share some data with you guys, last week the 10 hottest urban settlements were all in India and no other country. The extreme heat days in India have gone up by a staggering 50% compared to 2025 this year already. In places like Delhi, we've already seen temperatures of like 48 degrees, 47 degrees. So extreme heat is a major concern, for us in urban and rural India, both. It's more exacerbated in urban India because of the urban heat island effect and the rapid concretization and development of cities. And that was one of the reasons why we picked, to focus on extreme heat, which also is central to the government's agenda, in terms of providing relief to the overall populations. Um, so talking a little bit about our activation and the build phase, when we started developing this early action protocol with support from ADRA Germany, that provided financial support for both the development of the protocol, the build phase, as well as the fuel phase to activate this. So our team, ADRA India, we decided to focus in and around where we are. So we're based in New Delhi in India. And so during the build phase, we conducted some heat risk assessments and vulnerability mapping across low-income neighborhoods in Delhi. This was primarily done to identify high-risk districts, target populations. We wanted to target specifically migrants, informal workers, street vendors, children, and the elderly. We set up coordination at the community level to get insights from the community voices themselves to develop this protocol. And we also established coordination at the state level. So with the Apex disaster management body, the state level disaster management body, municipal corporations within Delhi, the Delhi Urban Shelter Improvement Board, which runs shelters for homeless people, and of course, local civil society organizations. Following this, this entire exercise of coordination, the assessments, we developed a menu of pre-agreed anticipatory interventions and operational protocols. These were aligned with the forecast triggers and any existing heat action plans. So we also worked very closely with the meteorological department that releases triggers, as well as forecasts to do with temperature, humidity, precipitation. As a next step, then we strengthened some community preparedness. We did training of frontline health workers. So these are essentially it's a cadre of auxiliary nurse midwives as well as some other health workers that work at the community level. So we trained them on extreme heat, preparedness, mitigation, We ran some awareness campaigns. We did a lot of IEC distribution work. We did street theater and localized risk communication strategies in these low-income communities. And then finally, we completed the site assessments and readiness checks for creating cooling infrastructure in the night shelters and shelters for homeless people. We set up hydration points. We created hydration kits. We upgraded some cooling centers. And then we also, as part of the activation, did some urban greening initiatives in public spaces, like shades and shaded structures at major crossroads where people have to stop at the traffic signal, so that they're not directly affected by heat. And then in the fuel phase, we activated some cooling and water security interventions through the installation of air coolers, water coolers, public hydration points. We deployed rapid cooling measures such as green sheds, tree plantations, and cooling vests for traffic police personnel that spend all of their day outside. We distributed some hydration kits, IEC material, and targeted community outreach activities. And we implemented intensive community engagement activities like sessions in schools, community meetings, street theaters. And this really enabled us to do rapid forecast-based action through the pre-agreed triggers that we had. And this led to a coordinated implementation mechanism and really helped us reduce the extreme effects of heat that we would have seen eventually. This was our very first development of a protocol as well as the activation. We were also concerned about, what the group has already talked about, that many organizations have support to develop a protocol, but maybe not to actually activate it and see how it works on the ground. So we were, immensely fortunate that we were able to do this work with the community, develop the protocol, and then activate it in the same season. And we had some amazing learnings from this, for this year when we update the protocol. And some of those lessons were, just building early multi-stakeholder engagement, which really helps create ownership and alignment. Existing coordination platforms that can accelerate collective action, evidence and field-led assessments that can help create consensus, just to have clearly defined roles and responsibilities to strengthen implementation. And also a sustained coordination event beyond emergencies, which is really critical for anticipatory action. We're trying to take some of these learnings and develop a new protocol this year. Like I said, this year the heat has already broken records, which was set last year. So this is going to be a sustained concern for us in India. We're going to continue focusing on extreme heat, but through this support from ADRA Germany, we're also planning to develop a protocol for riverine flooding and then activate that as well. And once we've done that, we'd be happy to share the reports with Anticipation Hub for your review, and we'd be happy to get your thoughts on that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Rohan, for this super interesting presentation, and yeah, keep up the good work. There are in fact very few. I think it was one of only 3 activations for heatwave last year, and so certainly really here also at the front line, as this is still a fairly new hazard that is been tackled. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
I'd like to spotlight now one other aspect before we dive then again into another round of Q&A, which is funding, so fuel and build funding. If Tim can bring up here the slide, where is it? Somewhere. Yes, if you go back to the previous slide first. So yeah, for the first time, we tracked basically available fuel funding and build funding provided by donors. This was part of their commitment under the Grand Bargain Caucus on scaling up anticipatory action. And together with the donors, we developed a framework to track this to get a sense of, and we received data from the EU, Germany, Sweden, and UK so far. And here you can see the breakdown. So in the pie chart on the left, you can see the fuel funding provided by donors, like the funding that is used to disperse, to implement activations. And Germany came out as the biggest funder of fuel funding, providing 69% or 94.9 million US dollars, and ECHO on the right-hand side as the biggest provider of build funding, the funding provided for system building, the frameworks, trigger, etc., providing 35.9 million US dollars, or 50% of the overall share within this data set. So the data suggests basically a sort of division among donors. We always say there's little or demand. We need greater coordination. So there seems to be already some coordination going on. But again, the with basically Germany fueling the system and ECHO building the system. Although to be fair, the share of Germany is super big as well, with 41% of the build funding. If we go to the next slide, here we have a fancy Sankey chart that shows a bit where fuel funding is channeled. It's mostly channeled through pooled fund mechanisms, like internal ones or interagency ones. The SURF, Julia alluded to it, is the biggest pooling mechanism, pooled fund for the implementation of AA. But the others are from the Start Network to Start Ready funds, the DRAF. There are also a number of NGOs that have internal pool funding mechanism, and you can see how each donor shares or distributes the fuel funding. Big share is channeled 69% to the UN. If we go to the next slide, here you can see the Sankey chart for the build funding. And here again, the UN is the biggest recipient of build funding. Here it's mainly WFP and FAO, if I remember correctly, and then the share between Red Cross and NGOs is more or less evenly distributed. I keep it with that for now, because I would like rather to get a discussion going, or get some comments, question from your end. So since we mapped this out for the first time, and we need to scale up anticipatory action, we need to scale up funding for anticipatory action. I'd like to pose the question: are we starving for more fuel to run the engine we've built, or do we need more build funding? What is the right ratio for this? Would be great to hear some reflections, also from the donors' end. And I see, Katrin, you may want to make a start. So
maybe just a cautious remark before we getting too enthusiastic, because I very much like the figures presented for Germany, at least, but I also feel like I have to highlight that we are talking about 2024, right? And that was just also before we had major budget cuts, and we are still working on the figures for 2025, because we also want to participate in next round's funding tracking, but I think the figures will look different, right? And also not only is it less in total, but I think it will also have a different balance between build and fuel funding. So I think it's a good start, but then we also have to see how this coordination between donors rolls out over time, right? And how we can maintain that. So just to be a bit cautious also about this first year exercise.
Yeah, and also I really want to highlight, of course, there are much more donors also active providing funding for anticipatory action. So this is really a very limited data set. So we hope it's really just the beginning, and we really want to encourage also donors to share their data with us, so that we can enable also these discussions, support coordination, And yeah, thanks also, Katrin, for to manage expectation when we talk about scaling up AA. Anyone who wants to come in here with a comment or question on AA financing? So, Julia, yeah, there was the analog hand first. Still works.
Yeah, I'm old school. Thanks so much. No, I think it's really great that we, that we're tracking this and that we're making progress on visualizing how where the funding flows go. I think in future we have some opportunity to disentangle or provide more detail on this. And I know that we certainly have our role to play in OCHA. I think as I put in the chat, a lot of so I think what this reflects, so the OCHA, the SURF funding obviously always goes directly to UN agencies, but we actually realized that, over 200 NGO, government, and Red Cross partners have received the SURF funding, AA funding over the last years. And I think that was about 20% or over 20% off by now 180 million spent or something in that range by the SURF. So that's a significant amount of SURF AA funding that has gone to actually NGO, Red Cross, and government partners. And equally, I do want to give a huge shout out to all of the donors to the pooled funds, because we that are not necessarily visible here. I think the SURF has about 70 plus donors every year. I think in 2025, I have to say the Dutch were the top donor. So if we look at, I think they provided sort of 16% of the SURF. And if the SURF prearranged $140 million in 2025, then 16% of that is, I believe, about 22 million that just the Dutch prearranged through the SURF. So, those are huge contributions that we will do. We'll improve also from our side to help make that more visible. But just a huge shout out to everyone who's been contributing to the data, to the huge effort of reviewing the data and making that visible. So thanks also again to you, Nico, and Tim, and all the Anticipation of colleagues. Over.
I thank you, Julia. I put a question out there in the chat. I would be really interested in get a sense. So, what do you think is the ideal ratio between build funding and fuel funding to make anticipatory action sustainable? We put it, I think, in the report as well. So, for instance, Germany provided $2.5 US in fuel funding. Sorry, for $1 in build funding, Germany provided 2.5 in fuel, Sweden 3.5, the UK 4.3, for instance. So just to give you a sense, where do we need more funding? In the grand bargain, I think we said like it's we need to scale up particular fuel funding, but what's the right ratio? Does such a number exist at all? Would be great if you can put it in the chat or raise your hand and make a case for, yeah, it has to be 1 in 10, 1 in 20, 1 in 3 is fine, or should be 1 in 1, whatever. Someone who wants to come in, put the number in the chat.
We do have some comments, Nico, in the chat, I think in response to the survey. Becky says it depends on the length of time that the fuel is being provided.
Mm-hmm. Ed, yeah.
I won't give you a number, Nico, if you'll forgive me, but I'll add some considerations that we should think about when we're deciding what this number should be, which is the sustainability of having these protocols built. If we can build protocols that exist for 5, 10, 15 years, that is a long-term investment that should be considered a good use of funds. There is a consideration we need to think about in terms of maintenance. So we have protocols. I don't know how it necessarily works for every other agency, but looking to improve the quality adapt to emerging trends, make sure that the changes to impacts due to weather are being captured, and how those are changing over time are also integrated. So I would throw in that as a consideration, but certainly when you look at the numbers in terms of protocols, you'd hope that we'd be able to pivot more towards fuel going forwards and do collective efforts to make sure that each of us are sharing the models and the protocol data that we have, so that others can access them and build their own protocols without having to do too much of a heavy lift and use too many build costs in the future.
Thanks, Ed. I see maybe this was too provocative. Now I want to provocate everyone a little bit to come up with a number, but its trick didn't seem to work. Anyone else who wants to come in here? Maybe also, or pick up, maybe pick a point. I mean, the maintenance. Where does it make sense to? We always we need to look into new sources of funding, innovative sources of funding. What options is out there realistically? What as thinking more as a system now, not necessarily from your institution, but keen to hear any thoughts of reflection. Katrin, yeah.
I'm so sorry. Can I just 1 second go back to the previous question? And sorry, but it took some time for me to bring my thoughts together. But so my question was whether you believe that in the long term, build activities or projects might become cheaper because there's already so much experience, because organizations need less time to set up systems, and because you don't have to construct new trigger systems, because you can already use maybe what's on the market, right? And whether you see there are opportunities also to save money, right?
I think this is directed to Ed, is it? Yeah. Ed, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, Katrin. I think there's some really great examples of agencies sharing models, having really constructive conversations about sharing those kind of elements of protocols that are the most expensive to build. And once you have some of those components, it's a lot easier to do the coordination for your agency and make sure that's so. We should certainly be aiming to do that more and more as we go forward. Certainly when I am looking at a new protocol, it is the first thing I'm doing is opening the Anticipation Hub data on what already exists and trying to contact those people. And hopefully, as you say, that should mean that we can be more cost effective as a community going forward.
Great. So unfortunately, we are slowly running out of time, at least for the official part of this event. So let me at this stage just say a big thank you to all the speakers or panelists and also the audience for this candid, super interesting discussion. I think, to wrap up, at least the takeaway from me is, of course, like I think we're all happy, right, that we see this expansion, this massive growth in frameworks, but we all see the need to harmonize, to align, and make some big steps, in particular on that front. And I also see that we need to continue the discussion how to balance fuel and build funding, or like see how we can best coordinate these different funding streams, crowd in also other funding streams. Again, I want to thank you all for your work, in particular to putting this report together. This is really the result of your work, also to reaching out to the colleagues, collect the data, to our team, also particular to Tim, to validate, cross-check all the data, And yeah, I highly want to encourage you to dive into the report, dive into the framework, the data we have, make your own analysis, try to make sense of this, challenge some of the numbers of the discussion. I think this is really to the benefit of the entire AA community. And yeah, please also reach out if you have data, insights, case studies to share. And yeah, so at this stage I'll officially close this session, but for the next 30 minutes I really want to invite you to stay and connect, yeah, in an informal way, discuss further the report, bring up your questions. At least Tim and I will stick around for the next 30 minutes. And yeah, other than that, I hope you enjoyed it, and see you at the next community conversation. Yeah. Goodbye.
We have a few questions from Lars in the chat, Nico, as well, which we could go back to as well. Lars, if you're able to speak, then please do. But I understood you couldn't speak because you're in a public place. So, okay. So yeah, I can read those out, and then perhaps the panel could reflect. So one of the questions, let me go right back to the start. It was about linking the anticipatory action working groups with established national and regional DRR and DRM and maybe climate mechanisms. How good are countries, or how good are we at avoiding duplication and sort of separating out of the work? So I guess this touches on the institutionalization data sets and the progress going on there.
Julia.
Sorry, my analog hand went up. And so I think that's happening. So one, I think we have a few good examples where we are linking anticipatory action working groups to the existing humanitarian architecture, or whereover I think that's happened in, oh, let me, well, we have a few, and then we have examples where we have been consolidating groups. I know that, for example, I think the Asia Pacific Regional Technical Working Group is, I think, merging with the Early Warning for All working group. So I do think that we are seeing consolidation happening and greater linkages. I think the other example I was looking for was Zimbabwe or another. So or where we have at least sort of AA technical groups reporting into the other fora, like into an intercluster coordination group, or into the humanitarian or UN country team, and so on. We have, and I think where we have effective co-chairing of groups through government and UN partners, that also really helps share the information and bring the expertise into the relevant fora, right? I mean, I think to some of the conversations that are happening around anticipatory action, some of these working groups are highly technical, right? And if I'm sort of, I don't know, if I'm a protection expert in the protection cluster, I'm not sure if, and I used to be in the protection cluster, so I'm not sure if I want to have an in-depth forecast discussion in every single one of my coordination group meetings, right? So I do think there is value in the ecosystem, but we just need to make sure that we have the right people in the room for the right conversation, that the information is shared, and that wherever possible, we consolidate and look at first what is existing already. And I think that is increasingly how, or I have seen several examples of where that is happening. Over.
Yeah, I think this, yeah, I'm sharing this view as well. I think we can see this as well, that usually, ideally, that's how it should go, but I have the impression also that it's increasingly, yeah, taking place. Another question. comment.
There's another one from Lars in the chat. I'll just read it out because I think it's an observation followed by a question. So what Lars wrote was, I would assume that a lot of work, so for activities and funding following a certain activation protocol, is just hidden as part of a wider preparedness funding and not under an anticipatory action scheme. So has this been a consideration in the report? And do you have the impression that program countries seek to build AA schemes are conversely happy with their own old style preparedness planning and rollout? So I guess it's kind of a little bit around where disaster preparedness ends and anticipatory action begins, and whether we're either double counting or missing some of the funding. And Lars, please feel free to correct me if I've misunderstood the question. But I've seen this come up before as kind of, you know, where does, when you're measuring this, is it a very distinctive budget line, or are countries or organizations sort of saying, well, this is part of the disaster preparedness and this is part of the disaster response, but it's all kind of reported, which could lead to a little bit of over reporting. But I guess on the other side, from some organizations, it's very hard to say sort of dollar for dollar, well, this is where we stopped doing disaster preparedness and this is where we started doing anticipatory action, simply because in some cases, not all, some, you know, like the draft is triggered and then the funding is released, but for other, perhaps some of the NGOs we've been talking about, it's one pot of money that they just use to the best effect when they can. But maybe someone else can reflect who's got more direct experience than me.
I mean, I could say maybe from the reporting side, this is a self-reporting exercise, so we depend very much on what organization report to us. And I think again what Tim just said. I mean, for some, anticipatory action is more approached from a preparedness perspective, and from others it's lesser. But I mean, I don't see this much of a problem, to be honest. I mean, particular for the reporting, I mean, from which budget line or so it comes, it's, I think, not really relevant as long as it is clear. And I hope it was clear, at least from the reporting side, what we want to track, what we count. So I don't know if that helps to answer your question, but it's always a report like this is always, again, an approximation of reality. It's not reality, right? We're trying to get to as close to it as possible, but I would never take if these numbers really at face value. So this is exactly this number, but you see the numbers are varying so and changing. So I think, I hope we're somehow approaching it, doing the reporting or using a consistent methodology. Julia, yeah.
I mean, maybe eventually I think we would like to see an expansion of the fuel versus the build, right? Like if we can work with the development partners, the climate partners, and with those investments to work for anticipatory action. And I think we've said that on various occasions before, can we have those types of climate investments? Can those initiatives that are investing in data, can they invest it in a way that we can use it for trigger systems, for anticipatory action? Can the data be made transparently available so that we don't have to do our own data analyses or, spend a lot of time and effort requesting data sharing agreements and whatnot, and, run around in circles and invest staff time to develop systems that could be developed easier if everyone were to share their data, and if those early warning for all investments and others were made in a way that enabled more accessible data for all, then I think that would enable us to reduce the need, for example, for some of the build investments as well. And I mean, just from the perspective of a person at risk, obviously, they would want 100% of our funding to go to fuel, right? If I'm in Greek and experiencing a heat wave, I don't want anything of that to go to forecasting. I want it to go into the heat wave protection. So I think that's the direction of travel. And obviously, it's hard to visualize everything, and a lot of the investments on that side, on the preparedness side, on the early warning for all side, etc., are very much benefiting us as well.
Someone else with a comment or a question? I mean, I have got still a few more questions I can pose, but I mean, for instance, yeah, I mean, I think what the report also shows, we have also an increasing number of major activations, in fact, also in increasingly, really complex environments like Afghanistan or Somalia, large-scale activations as well from the SURF, I think. What does the 2025 data also tell us about activations in these settings? Yeah, are we getting better at managing these? Are we still mostly succeeding in an environment which are more stable? What needs to happen here? Tim?
Yeah, I was just going to flag there is a case study in the report for those who haven't seen it from Yemen, and another case study from Cuba and Haiti, which I guess would also, particularly Haiti, count as very complex situations. And I think, please do correct me if I'm wrong, Julia, but the SURF or OCHA, they specifically target or focus on, to the extent possible, the more fragile and complex situations around the world with anticipatory action, because that's where the greatest needs are. And when a natural hazard or something happens in those settings, those people, because they're already vulnerable or have a lower coping capacity, that's where OCHA really wants to sort of focus and do its work. Is that still the case, or is that just something that I've picked up incorrectly?
No, I think that's correct. I mean, we have a responsibility for the humanitarian, for people who are experiencing humanitarian needs, who are the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable. But we also, at the same time, we have a global mandate, right? So obviously, we're focusing on the most vulnerable, across all countries, but we also know, looking at historical trends, that especially for climate emergencies, certain climate emergencies occur with, repeatedly in countries where we might not have other crises, or where we might not have a protracted, conflict-driven humanitarian crisis, but where coping capacity is still extremely low, vulnerability is high, poverty is high. So and that's where we do have a responsibility. And so we look at where now especially with the SURF and also with OCHA, the appeals that we've coordinated over the last 30 years, we have a good amount of data about, where have we had to respond in the past. And I think some of those come out as surprises. I think I was just looking at the data for Zimbabwe. That's our top 3 most frequent recipient for SURF drought response funding. And they don't have an ongoing protracted humanitarian crisis, right? But so we know that humanitarian needs will be high, because they've been in the past when extreme drought has occurred. And if from a funding efficiency perspective, if we are asked to respond to those crises again and again, then it just makes sense to set up a system whereby we can use the funding and everyone's time more efficiently.
Super, thank you. I also want to... Sorry, I'm muted. I also wanted to put in the chat the brief by the... A lot of typos in there, sorry. By the Anticipatory Action Task Force on Anticipatory Action and Fragile and Conflict Affected Settings. It uses 2024 data, so not the data from this report, but I think it summarizes very well some of the progress, but also challenges around. Do we have another question, a comment, or? Someone know? Then let me bring in one. Maybe the I don't know how to frame it. Maybe the technical and local not divide, but like I mean, we also have a lot more AI-powered early warning system, predictive analytics, etc. So could also say getting a bit more technology-driven, and how do we strike the right balance here between high-tech, fancy trigger models and genuine localized action. So someone who wants to come in here, maybe.
I can give it a go if you want, Nico. I guess it kind of goes back to that fuel versus build question, and also what is the requirement for us as humanitarian agencies, as those of us running pooled funds to disperse funds? How certain do we have to be? How much quality do we need to have in that risk analytics to put that financing behind it? I think we want it to be as good as possible, but also we want to recognise we need to be using the build funds effectively and efficiently. There are kind of various quality aspects that we can add to our models in terms of impact-based. So great section in the report about multi-risk, integrating these elements. But I think your question is maybe speaking more to this question of local indigenous traditional knowledge and whether or not we should be integrating that better into anticipatory action systems. I think this can be, there's some great examples of this where it's worked quite well and it's embedded and given trust from community perspectives. And I think it should be explored more in terms of what we can do to trigger anticipatory action on community foresight. But ultimately, we also want to make sure that we're using funds correctly and making sure that we utilize the advances in science that we have. So a bit of a balanced answer for you there, but I think this is certainly an area to explore more in as we maintain and build those protocols in the future.
Right, yeah. Thank you, Ed, for this balanced answer again. Any more comments or questions? Also, of course, on the report itself, what if you have any comment on that, what you'd like us to do, what we could do better. Next year also it will be the 5th edition, so I think then we can officially talk about trends. But yeah, let us know, put it in the chat.
Yeah, I think Katrin mentioned it earlier. She was looking at the sort of 4 years of data, but that is in the pipeline for next year, as we will do our best to have a kind of a 5-year trend of some of the data. It's going to take a little bit of thinking through, because if anyone ever reads as far as the annexes at the back, it does explain how the data collection or data collation process has changed over the years. So there's a chance that as the report has become sort of more widely used and more widely known about, more organizations are contributing data, which has obviously inflated the figures. Now it's very hard to go back 4 years and say, right, what didn't we capture in 2022? So we would need to sort of have some kind of way of representing that the earlier figures might be more underrepresented than the later figures. But yeah, I think it would be something useful for next year to sort of at least over the last 5 years of data to see what kind of trends are emerging. And I'm betting that drought will still come out on top once I put that data together.
All-time favorite has it. in the ranking. Becky, comment or question? Floor is yours. I can just unmute, hopefully. Yes.
Yeah, I think I managed it. Thank you. And this is with a question with the ulterior motive, because as I mentioned in the chat, I'm keen to reach out to you guys, because I'm a heavy user of those spreadsheets of yours that you supply kindly with your report. I just think it would be, I think when people are looking at it on a sort of in linking with the global status of early warning systems as I am, it is back to the earlier question about whether they're local or national, and this the difference between a national system framework and one that is a hyper local one, and so sometimes also that regional analysis. So a lot of these big reports, they want to look in by region, and also just to get a better feel for how much progress a country as a whole has really made with those frameworks, which is when a country has a heat plan, a heat framework, then it's a national thing. But as I put in earlier sort of chats about, some hazards are by definition hyperlocal. They only affect part of the country, and maybe even only a small community within that. So, but I think in terms of that mobilizing finance at the higher level, some organizations or potential funders need some of those bigger indicators of where some of those gaps lead, or how much progress is being made more at a national level. So I think some national and regional breakdowns I think could be helpful for that case, that cause.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's well noted. I mean, just to say, there are also some info sheets provided mainly by the regional technical working groups that exists. For instance, I think the Latin America working group has recently published 2 or 4 pager, something around this, showcasing the progress, particularly more where you have basically this national breakdown. There's also the newsletter from IGPAC, from IGAD-IGPAC, for instance, from Eastern Africa, where you get a bit more data. But I mean, it's well noted for sure. It's really helpful. I mean, again, the report has its own limitation. The goal is to provide an overview, really a quick snapshot of what's going on, and should in fact trigger these kind of thoughts or desire to really want to know more in deep dive than here. And but certainly take this up how we can better direct this or connect this. I saw another question in the chat from Anas Kitu, if I'm correct. If you're still here, you can also just unmute yourself. And but I think you were looking for what do you think technology is most efficiently addressing at the real pain in anticipatory action?
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, thanks Nick and everyone for the session. We are not an expert as you on the anticipatory action, but we are start to observing the anticipatory action. And during, let's say, the analysis of a lot of sessions within this talk, the community conversation, we listen to many of them and we start working on analysis for them. And we find that, let's say, there is a lot of difficulties and barriers, but things related to the, let's say, the forecasting, or things, let's say, to the funding or the other things. But we are thinking about, let's say, the collaboration part. If we have set on the triggers and everything, and we are waiting, because anticipatory action needs several actors, a lot of actors to work together to make a response. We found that there is might be some of the problems of how people can communicate, organization can communicate, collecting data, or etc. So I'm just asking if you think that, yes, this is one of the things that there is a pain, and this is the thing that technology can help in. And this is based on your question about where we can use the technology for the anticipatory actions. Thank you.
So it's a fairly broad question, like what role technology can play in advancing AA, if I understood this correctly. Someone who wants to come in here? I mean, maybe I can at least partially address. I mean, for instance, in the Eastern Africa region, again, I mean, I think there's a lot of, at least I would observe a lot of momentum on anticipatory action, on coordinating also anticipatory action that is led in particular by ICPAC, by IGAD, and they're now building also within the context of larger project, a regional database, for instance, where all the triggers, threshold, frameworks, and stuff are then monitored, and this is, for instance, could be a technological backbone when you want to facilitate then coordination on a political level, which is then of course a different process, but it's like one role, for instance, I would see for technology. I don't know if that helps. Julia.
That's a good point, Nico. And what came to my mind also was that I think in various countries we have, for example, collaboration with Google for flood forecasting and for using some of Google's AI for flood forecasting. We, for example, are using that in Nigeria as sort of a backup system. And I am pretty sure that WFP is also working with Google on or somebody else. I think, and it was in one of the previous Anticipation Hub reports about using Google flood forecasting or AI in Eastern Africa. Tim will know.
Yeah, I think it was last year. I forget which country, but there was also an example this year from Nigeria. I think Søren, he knows an awful lot. And yeah, AI is particularly useful in forecasting, I think, and that's where technology has a kind of key role, and there's other roles to play. Just to kind of slightly counter the point Nico just made, there's obviously an awful lot you can do in terms of coordination using technology. So having a database of all the different frameworks and activations. But in terms of what you're talking about, I think possibly about coordinating about who's doing what, I think there's still a value in the kind of in-person, face-to-face national level working groups and conferences and dialogue platforms that aren't necessarily captured in this report, but do happen all around the world. We're seeing lots more countries have their own national working groups being set up and their own dialogue platforms to discuss anticipatory action and do coordination around that. And I mean, one example which we did a case study on last year is in Sri Lanka, where they've got a very active working group. They've got the government brought on board, but the people that have been driving that process are very open about the fact that they met at conferences. They're all based near Colombo, and they've all been, I think, touching back to one of Lars' points earlier, they've all been working in DRM and disaster risk reduction for a few years. So it's almost as if they just knew each other. And then so as soon as one of them kind of started working on anticipatory action, they had a group of colleagues and a network within the country where they could share the idea. And a lot of it was, I guess, less tech focused and more organic, of people kind of discussing with their peers and their colleagues and moving from one organization to the other to take the approach with them of anticipatory action. So I think there's obviously an awful lot of coordination about the data and the frameworks and what's going on that can be done technology wise, but an awful lot of it still happens around discussions. And it was quite, not nice is the wrong word, but we had the Asia Pacific Dialogue Platform last year in Indonesia, in Yogyakarta. And at that time, the cyclone was just forecast to hit the Philippines. And I think 10 of the people who were from the Philippines at that dialogue platform just kind of met together and coordinated themselves in the room while they were there with all different agencies. So yeah, I would just kind of give a little reminder that, yeah, not all technology, not all coordination has to happen online. There's still a value in people networking and talking to each other and kind of sharing ideas about what works as well.
Yeah, but a great question. I think it already had this spirit of innovation in there, the spirit that, yeah, anticipatory action was born from. So, and we still need exactly this attitude to advance. I think we're running out of time now, like with 3:30 here being in Berlin. Again, I really want to thank you all for joining today's call, for asking questions, for this super interesting conversation. I hope we can have a lot of more of them virtually, or I don't know, maybe at a dialogue platform or whatever session, and discuss the report's finding and how we can jointly scale up anticipatory action. Again, many thanks for joining, and especially also Ed and Julia, who's still here, and Tim, of course, for presenting the report and everyone else. Thanks so much, and see you soon. Bye.
Thanks so much for organizing. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.